Don't be stupid. The words didn't just land. They echoed, sharp and careless, across the marble floor of the Grand Mercer Hotel in downtown Manhattan, a room built for billion-dollar handshakes and quiet power plays. Crystal glasses hovered midair. A server paused near the back wall. Even the low hum of conversation seemed to fold in on itself. Charles Whitmore, 39, founder and CEO of Whitmore Biotech, stood at the head of a polished walnut table beneath a chandelier that looked like frozen lightning. His tailored navy suit fit like authority itself. Across from him sat a circle of investors managing more money than most cities would see in a lifetime. Tonight was supposed to be a formality, the final dinner before signing a $3.5 billion acquisition that would send Whitmore Biotech's valuations soaring past $10 billion by morning. And yet the room wasn't watching the spreadsheets anymore. They were watching her. Naomi Carter stood still, a slim black folder pressed lightly against her apron, her name tag catching the warm amber light. 27 years old. Columbia Economics, 2 semesters short of a degree. Working nights to pay down $68,000 in student loans. She hadn't meant to speak. She had only leaned forward, quiet as a shadow, and said softly, "Sir, I think page 112 might need another look." That was when Charles turned, jaw tight, smile thin, and delivered the line that would ripple far beyond the dining room. "Don't be stupid. Stay in your lane. You're just a waitress." The sentence floated there, heavy with assumption. A few nervous chuckles surfaced from the far end of the table, the kind people offer when they're unsure whether they're witnessing confidence or something uglier. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't lower her eyes. She simply glanced down at the open binder resting near Charles's cufflinks, the financial projections highlighted in neon tabs. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline glittered, unaware that the real drama was unfolding 42 stories above the street. Charles believed in momentum, in dominance, in controlling the room before the room could question him. He had built his company from a Boston lab bench into a biotech powerhouse with patents lining the walls and headlines praising his vision. He was used to being the smartest person in every space he entered. What he wasn't used to was being corrected by someone he had already decided didn't matter. Naomi inhaled slowly, steady as a metronome. The investors watched her now, curiosity replacing amusement. Somewhere near the center of the table, a silver-haired partner from Westbridge Capital leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing not at her, but at Charles. Because power, real power, recognizes tone. And tone tells you everything about a leader. Naomi's voice, when it came again, was calm, almost clinical. The valuation model assumes full FDA clearance within 12 months. The average timeline over the last decade is closer to 18. No edge, no anger, just data. And for the first time that evening, Charles Whitmore's confidence flickered, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough for those paying attention to see it. The room had shifted, and no one knew yet how expensive that single sentence was about to become. Charles Whitmore did not like being corrected, especially not in front of men whose signatures could move markets before breakfast. He let out a short laugh, the kind meant to shrink a moment back into place. "We have a full regulatory team," he said, adjusting his cufflinks as if the gesture alone restored control. "Our projections are conservative." The word conservative lingered in the air like a polished shield. Across the table, the partners from Westbridge Capital exchanged a glance that lasted half a second too long to be accidental. Naomi did not step back. She did not step forward either. She simply reached toward the binder again, careful, respectful, never crossing into presumption. "The Phase 3 trial only concluded 8 weeks ago," she said evenly. "Based on historical Food and Drug Administration processing times, accelerated review still averages 15 to 18 months unless there is emergency designation. Your model assumes 12 without conditional language." The room tightened. A junior analyst near the end of the table began scrolling quickly through a tablet. Someone cleared his throat. Outside the windows, traffic flowed along Park Avenue, unaware that inside this private dining suite the temperature had shifted by degrees no thermostat could measure. Charles felt it. Not panic. Not yet. But friction. He prided himself on preparation, on anticipating objections before they formed. He had rehearsed every question, anticipated every scenario. What he had not prepared for was a server dissecting his valuation model with the precision of someone who had lived inside spreadsheets rather than between tables. "And you are qualified to assess that how?" he asked, tone light but sharpened at the edges. It was meant to dismiss without appearing cruel. Naomi met his gaze without challenge. Columbia University. Economics. 2 semesters short of graduation. Focus in quantitative modeling. She said it the way someone states the time. No performance. No apology. The silver-haired partner from Westbridge leaned forward now, elbows resting on the table. "Is she correct?" he asked, not to Naomi, but to Charles's chief financial officer. The question did not echo. It landed. The chief financial officer hesitated, then flipped pages. Silence filled the suite, thick and deliberate. A minute passed. Then another. The analyst at the far end stopped scrolling. "The 12-month assumption is optimistic," he admitted quietly. "We noted it as aggressive but within narrative tolerance." Narrative tolerance. A phrase built to soften risk. The investors did not smile. Charles felt the subtle reordering of the room. Attention was no longer orbiting him. It was triangulating. Naomi folded her hands behind her back, posture calm. She did not savor the shift. She simply existed within it. Because she understood something Charles had forgotten in his rise to the top. Numbers do not care about titles. Models do not bend to ego. And rooms built on power can tilt on a single, overlooked detail. The silver-haired partner closed the binder slowly. "We do not invest in optimism," he said, voice measured. "We invest in precision." And for the first time that evening, the weight of the 12-month assumption felt heavier than the chandelier above them. The air did not recover. It recalibrated. Charles Whitmore felt it in the way the silver-haired partner no longer looked at him for reassurance, but instead looked at the numbers again, as if numbers had suddenly become more trustworthy than the man presenting them. Precision. The word lingered like a verdict. Charles straightened in his chair, smoothing the front of his suit jacket with deliberate calm. "We can revise the projection," he said, voice steady, almost casual. "Adjust the timeline, restructure the milestone payouts. That does not change the core valuation." He spoke the way leaders speak when they believe authority alone can restore gravity. But gravity had already shifted. The chief financial officer cleared his throat again, this time less confidently. "If the clearance extends to 18 months, revenue recognition shifts into the following fiscal year. That affects debt covenants tied to this acquisition." The statement was not dramatic. It did not need to be. 1 fiscal year. 12 months. Numbers that looked small on paper but carried weight measured in billions. Naomi remained near the edge of the table, invisible no longer, but not triumphant either. Her hands were relaxed now, folded lightly in front of her apron. She had not come to embarrass anyone. She had come to serve water and clear plates. The irony was almost quiet enough to miss. A waitress had just protected investors from a projection that leaned too far into optimism. Charles leaned back slightly, recalculating. He had navigated regulatory delays before. He had outmaneuvered competitors, negotiated supply chain disruptions, convinced analysts to see potential where others saw risk. This was a setback, not a collapse. At least that was what he told himself. "The 18-month scenario is worst case," he insisted. "Our clinical data is strong. Our advisory board includes former regulators. We expect cooperation." Expectation. Another word built on belief rather than guarantee. The silver-haired partner tapped the binder once with his finger, not aggressively, simply thoughtfully. "Expectation is not a contract," he said. Around the table, the mood cooled from celebration to assessment. Phones appeared quietly under the tablecloth. Messages were sent. Market implications were calculated in real time. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, blending into the city's endless rhythm, indifferent to ambition. Naomi felt the weight of attention drift toward her again. One of the younger partners turned slightly in his chair. "If we adjust to 18 months, he asked, "what happens to the leverage ratio?" The chief financial officer answered, voice lower now. "It tightens significantly. Any delay beyond that triggers penalty clauses." Penalty clauses. The kind that do not show up in headlines, but show up in boardrooms months later. Charles's jaw flexed. He had dismissed her with a sentence meant to shrink her world back to trays and menus. Instead, her observation had expanded the room. He glanced at Naomi, this time not with irritation, but with something closer to calculation. Who was she really? And how had he missed it? Because in rooms like this, power is not just about who speaks the loudest. It is about who sees the risk first. And tonight, the first person to see it had not been seated at the table. The silence did not break. It deepened. Charles Whitmore could feel control slipping, not in a dramatic collapse, but in subtle degrees, like a stock price sliding before anyone admits it is falling. He had built his reputation on anticipation, on reading rooms before they read him. Yet tonight the room was no longer aligned with his rhythm. It had found a new focal point. The silver-haired partner folded his hands together and looked directly at Naomi. "Miss Carter, is it?" he asked calmly. She nodded once. "Yes, sir." Her voice carried no tremor, no pride, just steadiness. "If you were structuring this acquisition," he continued, "how would you model the timeline?" It was not a trick question. It was an invitation. Charles stiffened slightly. This was his negotiation, his stage. But stages do not belong to anyone once the audience begins to doubt the script. Naomi inhaled slowly, choosing precision over performance. "I would tier the valuation," she said. "Base price adjusted to an 18-month clearance assumption. Then attach performance-based earnouts if approval accelerates. That protects downside exposure while preserving upside potential." The words did not rush. They landed one at a time, clear and deliberate. The chief financial officer glanced at Charles, then back at Naomi, then at the spreadsheet glowing faintly on his tablet. The logic was simple, clean, difficult to dismiss. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass as if mirroring the shifting calculations inside the room. Charles forced a measured smile. "Creative," he said, though the compliment felt thinner than he intended. The silver-haired partner did not smile back. "Not creative," he corrected softly. "Responsible." Around the table, heads nodded almost imperceptibly. Responsibility was currency here. Risk was tolerated. Arrogance was not. Naomi's posture never changed. She did not step into the spotlight. She did not seek approval. She simply answered the question placed in front of her. Because for her, numbers were not ego. They were survival. Tuition bills. Rent in Brooklyn. Groceries measured against paychecks. 18 months versus 12 meant something different when you lived by timelines instead of projections. Charles could feel the recalibration becoming structural. This was no longer about a minor adjustment. It was about leadership judgment, about tone, about whether the man guiding a multibillion-dollar expansion could tolerate being corrected by someone he had dismissed seconds earlier. The silver-haired partner closed the binder completely now. The sound of leather against paper echoed louder than it should have. "We'll need to revisit the structure before proceeding," he said. Not anger, not accusation, just finality in motion. A pause followed. Heavy, deliberate. And in that pause, Charles understood something unsettling. The 18-month delay was not the true problem. The true problem was that the sharpest analysis of the evening had come from someone he had publicly reduced to insignificance. In rooms governed by capital, perception moves faster than numbers. And perception had just shifted away from him. No one reached for a pen. No one reached for a glass. The dinner that had been designed to celebrate momentum now felt like a board meeting suspended midair. Charles Whitmore kept his posture composed, shoulders square, chin level, but inside his thoughts were moving faster than the traffic 30 stories below. He understood markets. He understood leverage. What he understood less, in this precise moment, was how quickly respect could evaporate when tone betrayed character. The silver-haired partner did not reopen the binder. Instead, he turned slightly toward the others from Westbridge Capital. "We evaluate leadership as much as we evaluate assets," he said evenly. "Projection risk can be restructured. Judgment risk is harder to hedge." The sentence was calm, almost gentle, yet it carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Charles felt the shift solidify. This was no longer a technical review. It was an assessment of him. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "I appreciate thoroughness," he said, choosing each word with care. "We can reconvene tomorrow morning with a revised model. My team can incorporate a tiered structure by 9 a.m. Efficiency, control, restoration." It was the language that had built his empire. But the room did not respond with its earlier confidence. Instead, one of the younger partners spoke, eyes still on Naomi. "Miss Carter identified the flaw within seconds," he said thoughtfully. "How did your internal review miss it?" The question was not hostile. It was surgical. The chief financial officer exhaled slowly. We prioritized speed, he admitted. The market window is competitive. Competitive. Another word that sometimes means rushed. Charles heard it now as others might hear it. A justification. Naomi remained silent. She had not come to dismantle anything. She had simply answered what she saw. Her shift technically ended 20 minutes ago, yet she stood with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for acknowledgement that rarely arrives. Charles glanced at her again, this time without dismissal. In her calm expression, he saw something unsettlingly clear. She had not been trying to challenge him. She had been trying to prevent a mistake. The silver-haired partner rose slowly from his chair. The motion was deliberate, signaling conclusion rather than escalation. We will pause this acquisition pending further review, he said. Our board will not authorize release of funds tonight. There it was. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a door closing softly on $3.5 billion. A number that had been hours away from becoming headline reality. Around the table, devices lit up as assistants received messages. Schedules would change. Markets would speculate by morning. Charles felt the quiet finality settle over him. He had entered the evening expecting applause. He was leaving with postponement that sounded dangerously close to withdrawal. Naomi finally stepped back from the table, hands returning to the black folder she carried at the start of the night. She did not look victorious. She looked resolved. Because sometimes the most expensive losses are not caused by competition. They are triggered by a single sentence spoken without respect, in a room where everyone is listening. The meeting did not end with handshakes. It ended with chairs sliding back against polished marble and the muted vibration of phones delivering quiet consequences. Westbridge Capital's team gathered their folders with professional restraint, offering measured nods instead of celebration. No one mentioned the exact figure suspended in the air, but everyone felt it. $3.5 billion had shifted from certainty to question in less than 15 minutes. Charles Whitmore remained seated a moment longer than the others, as if still negotiating with gravity itself. His chief financial officer leaned in close and whispered about revised models, contingency calls, emergency updates to the board. Charles listened, but the words blurred at the edges. His attention was elsewhere. Naomi Carter had stepped back toward the service station near the wall, refilling water glasses that no one was drinking anymore. The chandelier light caught the edge of her name tag again. Naomi, a name he had not bothered to read earlier. He stood slowly and approached her, careful now, aware that every movement was still being observed. You have a strong grasp of financial modeling, he said, voice controlled, stripped of its earlier sharpness. It was not an apology. Not yet. It was recognition wrapped in restraint. Naomi met his gaze evenly. I try to stay sharp, she replied. No accusation. No triumph. Just truth. Around them, the investors continued quiet conversations near the exit, but their glances returned, curious about this new exchange. Charles understood optics better than anyone. He also understood leverage. What he did not understand until this moment was how easily credibility can erode when respect is absent. Why are you working here? He asked, the question sincere now. Naomi did not rush her answer. Because tuition does not pause for potential, she said. And neither does rent. The simplicity of it disarmed him. Outside, the skyline shimmered, steady and indifferent. Inside, something less visible was recalculating. Charles considered the earlier sentence he had thrown casually into the room, a phrase meant to establish hierarchy. It now echoed differently in his mind. Investors did not only evaluate numbers. They evaluated temperament, judgment, the ability to lead without diminishing others. The silver-haired partner paused near the doorway and glanced back once more, as if measuring the scene for future reference. Perception was already forming. Charles extended his hand, not in dominance, but in acknowledgement. Naomi looked at it briefly, then shook it firmly. Her grip was steady, not confrontational, not timid, simply assured. In that brief contact, Charles felt something more costly than a delayed transaction. He felt the weight of a misstep that would circulate through boardrooms by morning. Markets respond to data. People respond to character. And tonight, both had shifted. Naomi returned to her duties as if the room had not tilted around her. Plates were cleared. Water was poured. The mechanics of service resumed. But the hierarchy that had existed at the beginning of the evening did not return with them. Because once a room witnesses the true source of clarity, it never fully forgets who delivered it. By the time the last investor stepped into the private elevator, the Grand Mercer suite felt larger and emptier at the same time. The staff moved quietly, clearing untouched desserts and half-filled glasses, restoring the illusion that the evening had unfolded according to plan. But plans have a way of leaving fingerprints. Charles Whitmore stood near the window now, looking out over the East River, the city lights reflecting in the glass like distant constellations. His phone vibrated twice in his hand. Hey, message from the board. Another from a financial reporter asking for confirmation about a delay in strategic acquisition talks. News traveled fast when numbers that large were involved. He did not respond. Not yet. Behind him, Naomi Carter placed the final stack of plates onto a service cart. Her shift had stretched nearly an hour past schedule, but she did not complain. She had learned long ago that discipline does not require applause. It requires consistency. Charles turned back toward the room and walked slowly in her direction, the earlier sharpness in his posture replaced by something more measured. Westbridge will reevaluate by next week, he said quietly, as if explaining the situation to himself as much as to her. If they walk away, the market will interpret it as instability. Naomi nodded once. Markets respond to confidence, she said, but they trust transparency more. The sentence was simple, clean. It lingered between them. Charles studied her more closely now. The steadiness, the restraint, the absence of bitterness. He had expected defensiveness after the way he had addressed her earlier. Instead, he found composure. You could have let it pass, he admitted. You could have stayed silent. Naomi adjusted the handle of the cart slightly before answering. If the numbers were wrong, silence would not fix them, she said. It would only postpone the cost. Outside, a siren echoed faintly through the night, swallowed quickly by the hum of the city. Charles considered that word. Cost. He had built his career minimizing it, transferring it, restructuring it. But tonight the cost had not been hidden in a spreadsheet. It had been visible in a room full of witnesses. His assistant approached carefully from the hallway. Sir, the car is downstairs, she said. He nodded but did not move immediately. For the first time in years, he felt the need to pause before stepping back into public light. Naomi, he said, reading her name again as if committing it to memory. If you ever decide to finish your degree, send my office your information. It was not charity in his tone. It was recalibration. Naomi met his eyes steadily. I will finish it, she said. With or without your office. There was no defiance in the words. Only certainty. Charles gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and walked toward the exit. As the doors closed behind him, the suite returned to its polished silence. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of that night. A deal had stalled. A reputation had thinned. And the person who saw the risk first had never needed a corner office to recognize it. The elevator doors closed with a muted chime, sealing Charles Whitmore inside a mirrored box descending 42 floors toward waiting cameras and a driver who would pretend not to notice the tension in his posture. He stared at his reflection, at the precision of his tie, at the calm expression he had perfected over a decade of interviews and earnings calls. The market would open in less than 12 hours. Analysts would wake to rumors before sunrise. $3.5 billion does not quietly change status without attracting attention. His phone vibrated again. Inside the car, Charles leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. He replayed the moment. The sentence he had spoken too casually. The confidence that had bordered on dismissal. In boardrooms, tone becomes testimony. Investors remember how a leader treats those without titles. Meanwhile, Naomi stepped out into the cool evening air on Lexington Avenue, the city humming around her. She adjusted the strap of her bag and began the short walk to the subway station. No cameras followed her. No reporters asked for comment. Yet the most significant insight of the evening had belonged to her. The difference was not wealth. It was awareness. And as trains rumbled beneath the streets and headlines quietly drafted themselves for morning, two very different futures were recalculating under the same New York sky. Morning arrived without ceremony. At 6:30 a.m., the first market alert lit up screens across Manhattan. Whitmore Biotech acquisition faces structural uncertainty. By 7, financial analysts were dissecting the phrase with clinical precision. Uncertainty meant delay. Delay meant volatility. In the back seat of his car, parked outside headquarters on Madison Avenue, Charles Whitmore scrolled through the pre-market numbers. The stock was already down 4% before the opening bell. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. Investors do not panic at the first tremor. They observe. They calculate. They remember. Inside a modest Brooklyn apartment, Naomi Carter sat at a small kitchen table with a chipped ceramic mug and an open laptop. She had slept 4 hours. The glow of her screen illuminated columns of data unrelated to Whitmore Biotech. She was reviewing freelance financial modeling work she completed for a small consulting firm, $25 an hour, paid weekly. Precision did not depend on prestige. It depended on discipline. Her phone buzzed. A message from a colleague at the hotel. Did you see the news? She had. But she did not linger on headlines. She opened a spreadsheet instead, recalculating a healthcare startup projection for a client in Chicago. 12 months versus 18 months. Assumptions versus probability. The difference between ambition and accuracy. At 9:30 a.m., the opening bell rang on Wall Street. Within minutes, Whitmore Biotech fell another 3%. Commentators on business networks discussed leadership optics and confidence signals. They replayed a brief clip from the previous evening of Charles entering the lobby, composed but unsmiling. Markets do not hear private conversations. They sense tone through reaction. In the executive conference room overlooking Midtown, Charles stood before his board, explaining the structural revision plan. His voice was steady. His slides were clean. But behind every question was something unspoken. Why was the flaw identified at dinner and not during internal review? Meanwhile, on a subway car rumbling beneath the East River, Naomi stood holding a metal pole, headphones in, listening to an economics lecture she had downloaded months ago. She did not look like someone who had altered the trajectory of a multibillion-dollar negotiation. She looked like someone going to work. Yet the quiet truth of the previous night lingered in the market's movement. Precision had interrupted momentum. And momentum, once interrupted, rarely resumes unchanged. By noon, the numbers had settled but not recovered. Whitmore Biotech closed the morning down 8%, wiping hundreds of millions from market capitalization before lunch. Not a collapse. Not a catastrophe, but enough to send a message. In the executive boardroom, sunlight streamed across the long glass table as Charles Whitmore stood beside a projection screen filled with revised timelines and adjusted revenue curves. 18 months. Tiered valuation. Performance-based triggers. The exact framework Naomi had suggested, now reformatted into corporate language and bullet points. The board members listened without interruption. They were not hostile. They were assessing. Why was this not flagged internally? One director asked calmly. Charles answered with composure. We prioritized competitive timing. That was an error in judgment. The admission was measured. Deliberate. It cost him something to say it aloud. Across town, Westbridge Capital released a brief statement confirming that negotiations would remain paused pending structural clarity and leadership review. Leadership review. 2 words that carried more weight than the financial adjustment itself. Reputation is intangible until it shifts. Then it becomes measurable in stock charts and shareholder calls. In Brooklyn, Naomi stepped out of the subway station and walked toward the small consulting office where she occasionally assisted with modeling projects. She did not know the exact percentage Whitmore Biotech had dropped. She had not checked. Her focus was on a healthcare startup seeking seed funding. She opened her laptop at a shared desk and began recalculating patient acquisition costs under conservative scenarios. 12 months. 18 months. The math did not change because the logo on the slide was smaller. Precision was either present or it was not. Back on Madison Avenue, Charles dismissed the board for a brief recess. He remained alone in the room for a moment, looking at the revised projections glowing on the screen. The solution had not been complex. It had been overlooked. And the oversight had not been pointed out by a rival executive or a seasoned analyst. It had been voiced by someone he had underestimated in seconds. Outside, the market tickers continued to scroll, indifferent and relentless. Capital rewards clarity. It punishes arrogance. And in less than 24 hours, the difference between the two had become publicly visible. Late afternoon settled over Manhattan with a muted gray light that softened the sharp edges of glass towers and trading screens. Whitmore Biotech closed the day down just over 9%, stabilizing in the final hour, but far from recovered. Financial commentators shifted from speculation to narrative, replaying phrases like recalibration and leadership optics. In the executive office overlooking Madison Avenue, Charles Whitmore stood alone beside a floor-to-ceiling window, jacket draped over a chair, tie loosened for the first time that day. The city moved below him with relentless indifference. Delivery trucks double-parked. Pedestrians crossed against the light. Markets opened and closed without sentiment. On his desk lay a printed transcript of the board's questions from earlier that morning. One line had been underlined twice in black ink. Why was this risk not identified internally? It was a technical question with a cultural answer. Across the East River, Naomi Carter stepped out of the consulting office as the sun dipped lower, her laptop tucked securely into her bag. The modeling assignment had gone smoothly. Conservative assumptions. Transparent risk notes. No inflated projections. The senior consultant had thanked her for clarity, not creativity. She appreciated that distinction. Precision was not flashy, but it endured. Back in Midtown, Charles picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages he had ignored throughout the day. One stood out. A brief email from the silver-haired partner at Westbridge Capital. We value competence. We value composure. We value respect. Leadership reflects all three. No accusation. No anger. Just principle stated plainly. Charles set the phone down and exhaled slowly. He replayed the dinner in his mind, not the financial discussion, but the moment before it. The tone he had used. The reflex to diminish rather than listen. Numbers had been corrected. Models could be revised. But tone, once displayed in a room full of capital, could not be erased as easily. Meanwhile, Naomi descended the subway steps once more, evening commuters surrounding her in quiet routine. No headlines mentioned her name. No cameras followed her walk. Yet the shift that had altered a multibillion-dollar negotiation had begun with her steady voice. Under the same sky, in two different boroughs, two people absorbed the consequences of a single moment. One measured it in stock percentages and board scrutiny. The other measured it in the quiet confirmation that dignity does not require a title to carry weight. The next morning arrived quieter than the one before. Markets do not ring bells for lessons learned. They simply move on. Whitmore Biotech opened flat, neither punished nor forgiven, suspended in cautious observation. Inside his office, Charles Whitmore reviewed a draft of the revised acquisition structure one last time before sending it to Westbridge Capital. 18-month baseline. Performance-based escalators. Transparent risk disclosures. The language was sharper now, cleaner, not because the math had changed, but because the mindset had. He paused before pressing send and opened a separate message instead. To Naomi Carter. He had asked his assistant for her contact information through the hotel manager, not as charity, not as damage control, but as acknowledgement. The message was brief. Thank you for your clarity. If you are open to it, I would value a conversation about your future plans. He read it twice to ensure there was no condescension hidden between the lines. Respect does not need decoration. It needs sincerity. Across the river, Naomi sat at her small kitchen table again, reviewing notes for an online econometrics course she had enrolled in months earlier. Her phone buzzed with the incoming email. She read it once, expression steady, then set the phone down beside her notebook. The city outside her window hummed with ordinary ambition. She did not rush to reply. Her future was not defined by one evening or one executive. It was built line by line, formula by formula, hour by hour. In Midtown, Charles finally pressed send on the revised deal structure. The numbers were solid now. Conservative. Defensible. But more than the projections had shifted. He understood something he had overlooked in the rush of expansion. Leadership is measured not only by valuation, but by how a person treats those without leverage. Markets can absorb a delayed transaction. They are less forgiving of arrogance. As the day unfolded and the stock ticker scrolled in steady increments, two separate paths continued forward under the same skyline. One shaped by capital and scrutiny. The other shaped by discipline and quiet conviction. Money had almost moved in billions. Instead, something less visible had moved first. Awareness. And in the space between confidence and humility, the balance of power had quietly rewritten itself.